sky is a sea of darkness when there is no sun. The sky is a sea of darkness when there is no sun to light the way. When there is no sun to light the way, there is no day. There is no day. There's only darkness. Eternal sea of darkness. When the world was in darkness, and darkness was ignorance, along came Ra. When the world was in darkness, and darkness was ignorance, along came Ra. When the world was in darkness, and darkness was ignorance, along came Ra. When the world was in darkness, darkness was ignorance, along came Ra. The living man, the living man, the living mystery, the living man, the living man, the living
Some call me Mr. Ra. Some call me Mr. Ra. Others call me Mystery. You can call me Mr. Mystery.
Well, that was footage from the Chicago Jazz Festival, and that's how Sun Ra used to introduce himself on the stage. I'm very sorry I can't even try to do that tonight, but I want to introduce you to the speakers and our guests. Well, good evening and welcome, you all. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm very, very privileged to introduce you to Victor Schonfield, Graham Locke, and Chris Trent, three of the leading experts on Sun Ra in the UK and the world. They all have a long history of relationships with Sun Ra. I know some of them have met him personally and interviewed him, and I know Victor was the first person to bring Sun Ra to Europe, the Sun Ra Arkestra to Europe for a tour. And the three of them have contributed to liner notes to his releases, and they have written extensively about Sun Ra and the Arkestra. Well, they're gonna lead all us all into the world of Sun Ra, sharing some of their personal materials, both tracks and video footage. We're gonna have a break after six songs, I think. That's gonna be 10 minutes, so we can get a drink or cigarette, toilet, all that, and then we'll come back for 4 more songs, and then at the end we can have a discussion with them, or we can ask questions and talk about the materials we've seen. They're gonna introduce every material that they're gonna play for us tonight. Well, welcome them, and thank you very much for coming and doing this great event with us. Thank you.
Most of the other things you'll see in here tonight are in chronological order, roughly. And with the first and the next piece will be the first time Sun Ra was in a recording studio in 1946. His musical activity goes back to his teens, and in fact there are chapters in several books about what he did in those times. Not much survives in terms of recording. The only evidence is some sheet music he sent to Clarence Williams in the 1930s as a teenager. Williams used it but didn't credit him. But in 1946, Sun Ra was playing with the blues shouter Wainoni Harris, and they were on tour, and they were in Nashville, and they cut 4 tracks. 3 of them were a bigger band involving alto sax and a trumpet. This one is just Harris and Sun Ra. As well as being a blues shouter, Wainoni Harris had been a comedian and a drummer and various other things in his career before specialising in the vocals. And as far as we can tell, this is just a duo. The drums tend to simplify whenever the singing starts, so it's probably Harris playing drums as well as singing. And just as visual background for this, there's things like a roughly contemporary picture of Sun Ra, which may have been done later at the beginning of the 1950s, and some label for records that he was also involved in the 1940s, 1 or 2 anyway. So this is Dig This Boogie from the spring of 1946.
Right, there's a big leap from 1946 when Sun Ra had just moved to Chicago, from then to 1960, which is the date of the earliest of the other pieces you're going to hear this evening. So I shall try and fill in the gap in about 30 seconds. Sun Ra moved from Birmingham, Alabama in 1945 or 6 to Chicago, and he gradually became well established as a pianist, accompanying blues singers and doo-wop singers, and a musical director for nightclub acts and an arranger. Then in the early 50s, he gradually let it be known that in reality he was not from Birmingham, Alabama, but the planet Saturn. And in line with this, his plan was to form his own ensemble, to play his own music, and to record the results for his own label, Saturn. This didn't materialize in full until 1956, and the second half of the 1950s, they rapidly got into their stride, as you will hear from 1960, Rocket Number 9, Take Off for the Planet Venus. This is by a Sun Ra orchestra of 7 people, and there's a big contrast between the beginning and end of the piece, which are clearly deeply planned, meticulously planned and tightly rehearsed, and the middle section, which is much looser and full of improvising and different episodes. And I, as a long-standing Sun Ra fan, think that both aspects of the piece are terrific. The written piece, the written section is very, puts you on the edge of your seat, and the second written section at the end is a kind of release and a beacon of hope for the future. In the middle, we've got several solos that all have got a lot to offer. It's interesting to note 1960 free jazz had only just begun to appear already, although this is in a key, but the beat keeps stopping and starting. And the main reason I treasure this actually is for 2 of the best ever jazz solos, I reckon. First of all, John Gilmore, the tenorist, who was the star of Sun Ra's orchestra throughout its history. And secondly, Ronnie Boykins, bassist, who stayed with Sun Ra for the first decade plus of the orchestra's history, and then dropped out just before they started touring the world and becoming famous. And most jazz bassists throughout jazz history normally play pizzicato, plucking the strings. Ronnie Boykins is, for my money, the best ever arco player, bowing it, making it like the equivalent of a horn. And it's notable, Sun Ra must have felt much the same, because out of everything that happens in this very eventful track, Ronnie Boykins, who plays at some length, is unaccompanied. And he and Gilmore both play like composers in as much that they're not playing phrases moment to moment, but there's an actual trajectory that the solo follows. So, yes, please.
Rockin' them 90 off for the planet Venus, Venus. Rockin' them 90 off for the planet Venus, Venus. Zoom, 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 up in the air, up, zoom, up in the air. Rockin' them 90 off for the planet Venus, Venus, Venus. Rockin' them 90 off for the planet Venus, Venus, Venus. Jupiter, the second stop is 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 Jupiter. All out for Jupiter!
Lots of different aspects to Sun Ra's compositions, and as well as a really kind of exciting piece like we've just heard. He also wrote what I think are like very attractive tunes, and in fact one of the first things that attracted me to Sun Ra's music were some of the very sort of seductive kinds of tunes that he wrote, and there are several of those on an LP called Fate in a Pleasant Mood, which was actually recorded in 1960, the same time as Rocket No. 9. And one of the tracks on that is Lights of a Satellite, which is one of my great favourites. And it's a very deft and precise arrangement, as well as being a very catchy tune, and it's quite sparse. There are only 7 players again. Phil Corrin on trumpet, Nate Pryor on trombone, Marshall Allen, who's on alto sax and flute, John Gilmore on tenor and clarinet, and Ronnie Boykins again on bass, John Hardy on drums, and Sun Ra on piano. And if you just listen to the way that the parts just kind of all fit together, and there's a lovely balance between the reeds and the brass, and the way the piano kind of trickles through, threading everything together. And Phil Corrin's trumpet sound is really warm and lovely. And this doesn't really sound like very much other jazz that was happening at the time. It's not at all like hard bop, which was the kind of predominant genre at the time, and it is not very much like free jazz either. As I say, it was recorded in 1960. It was the last sessions that the Arkestra did in Chicago before they moved to New York. Later on, the track became more of a vehicle for John Gilmore. If there's anyone here who saw the Arkestra at the Mean Fiddler in London in 1990, which is probably unlikely, but if you were there, you would have heard him then playing like a magical solo, weaving through the tune. But this is a very good version as well. And to accompany it, there's a photo which was taken in a London hotel in 1983. It's from the first time I met Sun Ra, and I interviewed him there. And a photographer called Nick White came along. And we wandered through this hotel trying to find like a good place to take a photo. And I don't know if anyone's ever done that, but it's very hard to find a decent kind of site in a very kind of neutral and sterile environment like a hotel to take a photo. But we went down into the depths and came across a corridor where there was amazing kind of configuration of lights. So we took this, Nick took this picture, and it's one of my favourite pictures of Sun Ra. It's a memento of the first time I met him, and I've always, because of the lights in the photo, I've always associated it with this track. So.
Okay, the next track's got personal meaning for me. It's called Outer Nothingness. It was recorded in 1965. I must have heard it in 1965 or 1966. And that was the time when I realized that Sun Ra was somebody to take seriously and I was keen on, because up to then I'd heard samples of his work, but they weren't representative. And this one was like a real eye-opener. I reacted to it with images gleaned from when I was growing up in the era of horror comics and science fiction. I immediately pictured, as soon as it began, beings, possibly not mammals, almost certainly not human, swathed in exotic robes and carrying out arcane ceremonies from their probably other planet. And this is quite at odds with Sun Ra's title, which is Outer Nothingness, which I imagine signifies outer space and the randomness and the chaos that you find there. To me, this is really evocative. I once counted up, listening to it, that this actually contains 17 different episodes, but to me there's a consistent feeling that runs through the whole thing, partly improvised, bits that are clearly rehearsed in advance, although perhaps not written down. It's worth mentioning that this not only gives an exotic, otherworldly impression, but in fact, it consists, I think, of notes almost entirely. But what's missing from the jazz that we've heard up to now, that anybody'd heard up to now, there doesn't seem to be a key, there doesn't seem to be a beat. So the music's not related to anything else in terms of pitch. It doesn't have a home note. It's going wherever it wants, through the outer nothingness.
That's excellent. And I'd also say that all of Sun Ra's albums throughout the 1960s, he presented a string of records, each with its own compositional flavour. Nothing that you could hear from the early 60s to the late 60s is like any other album. That's true until the late 70s, at least, of Sun Ra. There's always a surprise with the next one. But the first time we were able to see Sun Ra in this country was in 1970, when, courtesy of Victor, who shouldered the organisational financial burden of bringing him here, he played London, and where I saw him, Liverpool. And it's the only concert I've been to at that stage where the entire audience got up and danced at the end. It was great. And it was very unlike the sort of formal ideas that Sun Ra would present on studio albums. Pieces were merged into each other, musical events overtook each other, and it flowed. There was barely applause between tracks. There weren't really any tracks in the live concerts at that stage. There isn't a decent recording, let alone a video recording of the UK events, but Sun Ra came back to Europe for a second time in 1971, and he played a string of concerts in Stockholm, Aarhus, Delft, Paris, Copenhagen and elsewhere. The first one he played was in Helsinki, and a Finnish radio station recorded the whole thing. It came out long after Sun Ra's passing as a double album, and it's still available. And this is the first time, I think, that his Sun Ra's composition Space is the Place appeared on record. It certainly predates the film or the CD of that name. And this is an extract from it. It's an unusual version. Space is the Place in its later appearances tended to be one of several space charts that would be introduced towards the end of a set or a concert, but here it's given its own space to stretch out in, and the places there, it's almost an a cappella vocal piece here. The vocalists you hear are what Sun Ra at the time described as his space ethnic voices: June Tyson, Judith Holton and Cheryl Banks, and you can hear John Gilmore and Achtel Ibar, Arkestra saxophonist and trumpist, Malik Ramadan and Art Jenkins too, I think. There were 28 people on stage, but you don't hear many of them in this extract. Which is only an extract because, as typical with live performances at this time, the pieces don't really have beginnings and ends. As backing for it, I've chosen a piece of film which was filmed a few weeks later than this concert. While he was in Europe, Sun Ra managed to sell some what he just was able to describe as master tapes, or maybe they weren't, and fund the band or most of the band for a trip to Egypt. And the home movies, which tend to be around on YouTube, like these, of his trip to Egypt, are the visual background for this, which is Space is the Place from Helsinki in 1971.
To want to know how to live out of space, to really be free as an endless free.
Space is the place.
Oh, that's an
Space is the
endless free.
Space is the place.
I'm going to start with some personal memories. The first time I saw the Sun Ra Arkestra in the flesh was the only Sun Ra concert I actually organised, although I did organise their tour. And this was in 1970, and it was a tremendous experience seeing a couple of dozen performers all dressed in the space robes that you've seen in some of these film clips, and parading and dramatising the music. And I was a bit disappointed in the first half of the concert, to be honest, because those qualities weren't so much on display. It was rather austere, free improvising. But the second half of the concert opened absolutely explosively with probably a version of the piece that I'm going to play you now. I can't play you the Queen Elizabeth Hall concert because the recording project went wrong, but 3 years later they were giving a concert at New York's Carnegie Hall, not their first Carnegie Hall concert, but they featured the same piece that really knocked me out the beginning of the second half in 1970 at the Queen Elizabeth Hall. The piece is called Watusi, and you can hear it very rapidly, the transformation from what is basically a conventional jazz big band of brass and reeds and rhythm. Almost instantly it gets transformed into a 24 strong percussion orchestra where there are no pitched instruments whatsoever, not even the percussion. It's all to do with rhythm patterns, and these rhythm patterns do have a beat, every one of them, but they're all irregular to each other. So probably the beats are the same length, or subdivisions are the same length, but it sounds as if everything's turned into a river of percussion, which, like the kind of river that bubbles on and crosses rocks and moves into shallows and then splashes, it's constantly transforming its nature. And they still do it nowadays, or the equivalent. Not every gig, but I hope they'll do it in Nottingham in a couple of days' time. The orchestra suddenly gets revealed as not being a big band at all, but this percussion ensemble, which is quite remarkable. On the particular Carnegie Hall concert that I've got, there were only 2 kit drummers and 3 other specialist drummers, hand drummers. So that's 5. Then 2 of the Sun Ra front line. To this very day, you get 2 of the saxophonists usually. Whenever they're not called upon to play saxophone, they have hand drums or small-scale drum kits, and they'll spend the rest of the time drumming, reinforcing the specialist drummers. And then when they do a number like this one, Watusi, sometimes known as Watusa, everybody else downs their instruments and joins in on small percussion instruments, claves and maracas and tambourines and you name it. They play something or other. So here you can hear it happening. one thing I keep forgetting to say, I think we all keep forgetting to say, at the time that Sun Ra announced he was from Saturn, he also let it be known that he was in fact a reincarnation of the ancient Egyptian sun god Ra. And Sun Ra had two realms, quite divorced from 20th century America, that he wanted to lay claim to, not only on his behalf, but on behalf of the black American nation. He wanted people to become aware of these realms where black Americans stood for something quite different. One of them was the future in outer space and other planets, and one of them was the distant past when ancient Egypt was the foremost civilization in the world, and the people responsible for the civilization were black Africans. So this is a very important factor, as you could see from the Space is the Place video in his work. Watusi, yes please.
quite a lot of Sun Ra records were recorded either live or sometimes even in rehearsal on a single tape recorder. But towards the end of the 1970s, he managed to make a handful of albums in a studio. They include Sleeping Beauty, On Jupiter, Strange Celestial Road, and Languidity. And I think these particular sort of group of late 70s studio albums have a particular kind of sound quality all of their own, partly to do with his use of like ethereal voices on them, which were quite often put on after the original recording, but also just I think it shows his kind of dexterity as a studio technician, as it were. And the track I particularly like here is called Springtime Again from Sleeping Beauty in 1979. It's a great composition, and it's also a great arrangement again, I think, and it's very different from the kind of arrangement that you heard earlier on in Lights Over Satellites. Sun Ra's working with a much larger ensemble here. There are 28 people listed as personnel, and what he's doing, I think he's creating kind of layers of textures here, and he's drawing on electric piano, electric basses. And I should add that he was one of the first jazz musicians to use a synthesizer and electric piano, and to introduce the electric bass into jazz. He's got two electric basses here, electric guitar, flute, alto, tenor and baritone saxes, bass clarinet, bassoon, 3 trumpets, 2 trombones, French horn, vibes, and at least, I think, 4 or 5 specialist percussionists, plus, as Victor was saying about the Watusi, lots of the other instrumentalists also join in and play percussion as well. And I think there's like so much happening in this track. It's a kind of a lovely swirl of languorous sounds that kind of float in and out all the time. And it also has a very nice John Gilmore tenor solo in it as well. Again, it doesn't sound like kind of jazz in inverted commas. It's a strange hybrid, I think, of jazz and pop and soul even. And I should say it's been reissued on Art Yard on this CD. I'd just like to say that there are lots of Sun Ra albums available on kind of dodgy labels, but Art Yard is the shining exception. Peter Dennett, who runs the label, always takes great care with the packaging and the presentation, and he always tries to get the optimum sound quality that he can from the original tapes. And he's also just moved into publishing, and next week I think there's a new book out called Omniverse Sun Ra, in which Chris has been involved, and we're hoping it'll be in the bookshop here next week, so I'd recommend that to anyone who's interested in reading about Sun Ra. On the visuals on this track, I've put 2 pictures on. The first one is a painting by Joe Overstreet called Boat of Ra. From the painting was done in about 1967. Joe Overstreet is an African-American painter, and I think one of the leading American artists of the last 60 years or so, and he worked with Sun Ra in New York in the mid-60s for a while, and this painting was his kind of tribute to Sun Ra. And the photo you'll see after that is from the same London hotel in 1983 that you saw in Lights Over Satellite. And I interviewed Sun Ra there in the hotel on a kind of a landing. The hotel had a staircase like going up the middle, and there was this kind of wide landing around each floor. And we did the interview on the landing, and he made a a member of the orchestra stand in each corner. When they kind of stood there like this all through the interview, just to make sure we weren't interrupted or disturbed. And then at the end of the interview, Nick White again took the photo of Sun Ra leaning on the rail, just on this kind of the rail around the central stairwell, and the very ornate hotel ceiling in the background. So, okay, this is Spring. Okay. I've already said that one of the great attractions of Sunrise music for me is the compositions and the way he arranges them. The other great attraction, I think, is seeing the orchestra live. I guess there's so much colour and movement and the costumes. And it's like a whole surreal spectacle. And on this particular track I'm going to play next, which is Mac the Knife, from a TV broadcast of a live concert in Spain in 1985, the band are just so clearly having great fun. It's like being at a party, and I know Victor has told me that in some of the gigs he saw where there wasn't a stage, where the band are just performing on the floor, they would like wind around the audience and turn the whole event into like a huge party. On this track, they are on a stage, but they're clearly having a party amongst themselves. And I should say that the gravel-voiced singer on this is James Jackson, and listen out too for John Gilmore playing clarinet, and keep an eye on Ronald Wilson, who takes the long tenor solo, and he just returned to the orchestra after an absence of 25 years. And according to John Zweig's excellent biography of Sun Ra, he says that Ronald Wilson had just unexpectedly, out of the blue, turned up at a concert, and Sun Ra greeted him by handing him a piece of music with his name written on it and said, "I've just written this part for you." But there are lots of stories like that about Sun Ra's, mystical powers. Anyway, it's worth watching because there's some kind of interesting interaction going on between Sun Ra and Ronald Wilson on this piece. Probably along the lines of Sun Ra saying, "Keep on playing," and Ronald Wilson thinking, how much longer do I have to play? But I'll just end by saying that Sun Ra also said that jazz is happiness, and this track always makes me feel happy, so I hope it will have the same effect on you.
pretty teeth there, and his shoulders curly white, just a jackknife has McHeath, and he keeps it out of sight
all the time.
when the shark bites.
Oh, he will bite.
With his teeth there, scarlet below, start to spread. Fancy gloves though, that's McHeath there. So that not a trace of red on the sidewalk. Sunday morning, lies a body, oozing light. Someone sneaking round the corner. Is that someone?
Could be someone be?
Mac and
I.
Louis Miller disappeared there.
That's right.
After drawing out all of his cash.
Every percenter.
McHeath is spinning like a sailor.
Like a sailor.
Get out before I do something right.
Something right.
From a tugboat on the river.
On the river.
Hey, cement back just dropping down.
Dropping down.
Oh, the cement is just for the weight there. Now that Mac is back in town.
Like Graham said, Sun Ra was occasionally surprised musicians. You'd see them on stage hunting through sheaves of music when he started a piano introduction for something they weren't expected. Like in a different field of music, the Grateful Dead, Sun Ra was an architect of sets and wouldn't come on stage with a set list. People would have to hear what was going to happen next and then join in. And that features a bit in this next piece which I'm going to play, which is from a television broadcast from 1986. Parts of this next thing have been released on CD. It's also been released, most of it, on a Saturn cassette, which you could buy at shows. It's from their first visit behind the Iron Curtain, I believe, East Berlin in 1986. The piece is called Beyond the Wilderness of Shadows, and I think that refers to the section at the end where there's some pre-prepared material comes into it, but mostly it's improvisation. And what you're hearing here is supplemented by television footage and illustrated by television footage. It's on YouTube. Somewhere there is a good copy of this. The whole concert is magical. It's 90 minutes long, but it deserves a proper release. But the material where Sun Ra sits down to start the piano is called Beyond the Wilderness of Shadows, and I've prepended to that the last few minutes of a glorious instrumental improvisation involving band members and himself. And you'll hear on this one at the beginning Danny Thompson on flute, mostly off camera, and near the end the alto saxophonist who joins in with Sun Ra for a great solo is Pat Patrick, who was then in about 40 years into his musical association with Sun Ra. And this is Beyond the Wilderness of Shadows from 1986.
There is a question. Give you a mic. Yeah.
Hello. I follow a lot of artists who cite Sun Ra as a big influence on their music today, contemporary artists. I've always wondered who Sun Ra's influences would have been, and some of you guys have said that you've been fortunate enough to interview him. I was wondering if you ever spoke about those artists that were inspiration for him when he was growing up, and who those people would have been.
This is only part of the answer, but throughout his life, Sun Ra maintained that he, for all practical purposes, he didn't begin music until he changed his name in the early 50s. The only exception he would ever make, which he proudly made frequently, was that he had served for almost a year in the Fletcher Henderson Orchestra as the assistant pianist and the assistant arranger. He was rightly proud of this because the name of Fletcher Henderson, more than any other, is associated with the development and the flowering of big band swing, which of course was the popular music of America, black and white, for the best part of a generation. Now, I'm sure that's not his only inspiration, but over to my friends.
He also said in interviews that he honoured all the big band, black big bands of the 1930s and 1940s, and he would incorporate Jimmy Lunsford tunes. There's Cab Calloway tunes on record, and you can often hear in his own playing Fat Swallow. He'd quite often incorporate phrases from a handful of keys and things like that in his music. He very rarely take a composition by a post-Second World War composer, but he was very fond of the show tunes as well. In his later years, he would play Gershwin and many other of the swing era tunes, not by black composers. So that's the start of it.
Yes, I mean, I would just concur with that. If you look at the cover versions that he did, you can see some of his influences there. He covered Fletcher Henderson tunes, Duke Ellington tunes. Mind you, he also played Rachmaninoff at times as well, but I'm not sure how much of an influence that was. So when I spoke to him, he got very indignant at the fact that Mozart had been buried in a pauper's grave. He thought that was outrageous. So I think his influences, it's the big band, the black big bands are the core influence, I'd say. As well as that, he was influenced by a whole array of other musicians and musics, but it might be harder to put your finger on the other ones.
He was also fond of a story in later years that someone had addressed a big envelope parcel of sheet music to him at his home in Philadelphia, saying to Sun Ra from Scriabin. He was very fond of Scriabin, which is possibly, when you come across Scriabin's own sort of confusion between colour and sound, is you can see some of the links there as well. Another classical influence.
In that last clip, we saw Sun Ra with a Yamaha DX7 on top of his grand piano. And then earlier, when you were talking, so one of you, I can't remember who, mentioned that most of his live performances his recorded performances were rehearsals or live, and that he eventually made it into a studio and he did something with that. What was his relationship with technology? Was it something, because he was quite groundbreaking obviously as a musician, how did he embrace new technology? Was that something he was wary of or fully embraced?
He was fanatically in favour of it. He explored everything as soon as it came out, or even earlier. I think the Moog synthesizer was actually developed with him acting as a test bed, a consultant. Way back in his career, he was one of the first people to record themselves on tape, at a time before there was tape, when it was wire recording and ribbons. What was the technology, Chris?
Wire recording. Some of his early surviving recordings are on paper tape coated with magnetic stuff as well.
Right.
If you look at the latest reissues of the albums My Brother the Wind and Space Probe, which are out in good sound on iTunes, but not yet available mostly on disc, CD or LP, you'll see that Bob Moog's assistant Gershon Kingsley is credited as programming the Moog. Sun Ra invited himself, or was invited, to the Moog studios in Uptown New York for a demonstration of an early model, and he took one away with him. I don't know if he ever paid for it, but they decided he'd be a good person to road test it. So yeah, he was fanatically keen on it.
Yeah. I asked him once why he was so fond of the synthesizer and playing these sort of way out solos in concert, and he said to me, "Well, I like all the sounds that upset people."
Well, funny.
He also introduced the electric sax as well. Those sort of electrified sax, which Mark Lyon still plays.
Yeah. Although it's the number of keys on it corresponds to a brass instrument. It's usually called electronic valve instrument. Yeah, there'll be one of those on display here on Sunday, I think.
Yeah, you'll see that on Sunday.
Yeah.
But all the band used to play it at one time.
Yeah.
Yeah. We heard like a selection from across his recorded Earth, but there's obviously lots of things that haven't been touched on now, like My Brother the Wind and things. So there were some of your favourites and some favourite performances, but what are some of your favourite recorded works other than the ones we've heard?
Oh, I can answer that because my first choice was vetoed by the other two because it was too bloody long. It's a track called Atlantis that Sun Ra made in the later 60s, which features not only the big band performing as such, but then it gives way to Sun Ra playing the most far-out keyboard you have ever heard, switching from organ to synthesizer, which was quite something in 1967. They didn't have synthesizers widespread. Over to you, Graham.
Well, it's hard to name just one. I mean, I like a lot of the early ones, like Fate in a Pleasant Mood and We Travelled the Spaceways and Interstellar Low-Ways and Jazz in Silhouette. I like that group from the late 70s that I mentioned that were done in the studio, especially Sleeping Beauty. And I like, you were asking about not live ones, but I also like some of the live ones. Live at the Hackney Empire, I think is really good, and Live at the Mean Fiddler. I mean, that's possibly because I was at those concerts, so they kind of mean something special to me. But one of the other ones I like, one of the more way out ones, is Cosmic Tones for Mental Therapy. Yeah. That's a really nice one. But anyway,
I go along with most of that. In fact, Atlantis is an example of a group of LPs from that time where he would compose LPs a bit like he composed sets. He'd have two contrasting sides of a record, and the other things I think from the Magic City, When Angels Speak of Love, the sequence of pieces is just really satisfying. And a late example, favourite of mine, is a late studio session into Celestial Love.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That's some good ones.
There was one there.
Hi, just on the Magic City, I wonder whether you could possibly clear something up that's intrigued me for years. When people write about it, they quite often mention John Coltrane's Ascension and Free Jazz by Ornette Coleman. But I read recently that Ascension, although it was recorded a couple of months before the Magic City in June '65, it didn't actually come out until 66. Is that right? And if so, presumably Sun Ra hadn't heard it yet, and I'd always assumed that it was kind of, the Magic City was a response in a way to the kind of wildness of Ascension, but it appears not to be the case, and it kind of leads me to a broader question: was he that influenced by any of his contemporaries? Because he seems to exist in a world completely, in another world completely outside of even the freest jazz that was happening at the time.
I'd like to rush in on this. I feel that although Sun Ra's music was very diversified right from the beginning of his career as Sun Ra, there was definitely a change of emphasis in the first half of the 1960s when, don't forget, Ornette Coleman and Cecil Taylor represented free jazz, and people bit by bit were gradually trying to get to grips with it and assimilate it into their own point of view. I always get cross when John Coltrane is bracketed in with this, because he was a very late comer, one of the last people who switched from a conventional jazz approach to a free jazz approach. And I feel that, coming back to your specific question about Magic City, that is almost the critical turning point when members of Sun Ra's Arkestra had assimilated the example not only of Ornette Coleman and Cecil Taylor, but specifically Albert Ayler. Albert Ayler was the first person who really introduced noise into jazz, multiphonics and tones that you couldn't, notes that you couldn't assign to a particular pitch. They were in the process of wrestling with this in the first half of the 60s, and after Magic City, I would say, is probably, you could probably tell us the month, Chris, when people really had assimilated it enough to make sense, trying their own hand at things that were not only free of chord sequences, but as we know from the later work of John Gilmore and Marshall Allen, they could be magnificent masters of noise playing. So over to you, if at all.
John Gilmore influenced Coltrane's playing in the early 60s, but I think that, like Victor says, it was a melting pot. They were taking ideas from each other. But I think that Coltrane used some things he'd heard Sun Ra doing over the few years in New York to assemble the ideas of Ascension in some respects. The sequence of solos and so on, very atypical of Coltrane's other work and the ensembles in that. And he was using a saxophone player that Sun Ra developed in the previous 2 years as well on that record.
Of course, yeah. I'd just like to come back. Musicians are not like us, particularly named musicians living in New York. They don't learn about new developments from records. When the records hit the counter of the record shop, they're actually jamming with the people who are going to be making the innovations and making the records 2 or 3 years hence. And they hear about things long before they hear about new developments long before the new developments actually get fully crystallized, long before they actually reach disc or they reach public performance. And it's a subject for another time, but it's one that interests me, and I'm glad you raised it. Thank you. Yeah.
Oh. Oh yeah, thanks. You've obviously all met the chap, and this is quite besides, I'm just intrigued, quite besides his music. You all speak so fondly of him. What was he like as just a person, off the stage, away behind the music? Who was he?
You've reminded me of something that I was going to say that is a bit oblique, but I got to know Sun Ra reasonably well in his later years after our business relationship came to an end. And the last time he was in England, 1991, he told me privately, and these are his exact words that I've never forgotten, "The most important thing I do is what you call the poetry. And this shocked me. I couldn't believe it. I remonstrated, I argued back. He stuck to his guns. And actually I've kept that to myself all these years, but I think maybe I was wrong to do so. He was warm. Our relationship basically was that he liked to hold forth and I liked to listen. But he was welcoming and kind. Made you feel you were something. I think he had that gift that leaders do. I remember I once was discussing Coleman Hawkins with him years earlier, and I mentioned that Coleman Hawkins at a particular stage was like a rhinoceros. And he said, "John, come over here, listen to this. Tell him what you just said." And I just made this passing comment, and he thought it was something that Gilmore should hear. And Gilmore agreed with me, and so did Sun Ra.
Well, I can't claim to have known him all that well. I interviewed him twice, and as Victor says, you only had to ask him one question, and he was happy to talk for about 45 minutes, and he'd only stop when you had to turn the tape over, and you'd ask him a second question, and he'd be off again. He spoke in a very sort of quiet way. In fact, during the first interview, I was struggling to understand because he had a southern accent, from the southern states accent, and he spoke very quietly, and he was talking about all these things that I had no idea really what they meant. So it was a hard job to transcribe that tape. The second time I met him, I actually spent some time with the group. We went up to Liverpool and stayed there overnight.
You too.
and then they also played a couple of gigs in London. And again, he was very nice, but he was, he kept there was an aura about him. I don't think, you were saying what was he like kind of behind the music, but I don't think there was a behind. I think he was the same person. What you saw on stage, I mean, he didn't always wear glittering capes, but his attitudes and his ideas were the same on the stage and off. So he was very nice, but I compared, say, to, I was able to talk to June Tyson and John Gilmore during that time, and they were like two of the really nicest and friendliest people I've ever met. Sun Ra wasn't like that. He, as I say, there was this aura around him, and but he was always very accessible and good to talk to, and basically good to listen to.
My contact with him was smaller than yours, I think. I'd say, when I first saw him in 1970, I'd say a few words to him and listen to a very long answer. In later years, I'd say hello to him again, but he wouldn't necessarily remember me. Last time I saw him, getting off the bus in Brecon in playing at that festival in 1990, and he was just about functioning as walking little. He wouldn't talk at all. He was happy to say hello, and move on. The person I liked best out of the orchestra, whom I like the musicians very much, that I did talk to, James Jackson, who basically gave up a lot of his life to play in Sun Ra's band. He was an excellent person. Yeah.
John Gilmore too. I'd like to chip in, not in response to a question. Chris Trent on the left of this table is, and for some years has been, probably the world's foremost authority on Sun Ra. Other people held that position before him, but it's been you for a long time, Chris, and I think we're privileged to have you. And Chris also has a book that no doubt is out of print, but it's the Bible for all Sun Ra fans. It's called The Earthly Recordings of Sun Ra. It's jointly authored with Robert Campbell, who's an American Sun Ra fan. Robert Campbell did the first edition, recruited Chris for the second, and nobody knows if there's going to be a third.
Yeah.
But I would like to emphasize this book, if you ever come across it, is invaluable and fascinating. And Chris himself is a tireless researcher and documenter of the music and the musicians.
Well, I think I got involved because I could hear things in the music which were misrepresented in print, and Sun Ra used to say, give credit where credit's due, and I thought it was due to him as well.
Well, I think, so I'm here, sorry. If you don't have any more questions, well, I want to mention that these books you are mentioning are upstairs, and people can see them and read them upstairs in the study near the exhibitions. Well, thank you so much for sharing all these stories and knowledge with us. It's been amazing. Thank you. And there are a few tickets left for Sun Ra Arkestra on Sunday, so if you don't have a ticket and you want to come, please get one. And tomorrow for Alien Radio as well. Thank you for coming, and hope to see you soon. Thanks.